Good morning. This is Professor Menton, and let me begin today with an apology. I had hoped to get through this entire series of budgeting. I don't think that's going to be um, reasonable given the amount of time that we have left. So I'm just going to try to give you an overview of how you would work through the remainder of this problem. And if you want to play with it, I think you should take some time and fool around with it. I think it's interesting if you're an accounting person, in particular, like I know a couple of you have designs to go on and become accountants, this is something that I think that you would really want to take a look at because you may be intimately involved in doing the budgeting in this form at some point later in time. Now, this is done on a manufacturing business, so it would vary according to your business and so forth. But this does at least give you some sort of an idea of how you would work through it. Now, yeah, I'm looking at the materials budget now. And the materials budget, I have here penciled in some costs for both the polyprop and the polyethylene plastic. And these numbers would have came from sources. I would have called the plastic manufacturers and said, what do you expect the price to do over the course of the next year? I would have looked at the price of oil and looked at the projections for the price of oil over the next year because these two products are made from that. We have seen over the past little while, and I'm talking pre coronavirus, we've seen some reduction in demand for these products. And I'm not quite sure what the reason for that is, but I'm going to talk about these products. I'm talking about some of these plastics. And it could be because we're doing a better job of recycling them. It could be that we're using different materials to go into certain products. There's all sorts of different reasons. It could be just demand is different, but you would have to figure out what it is that is happening with that. You then get your usage, and these usage numbers are going to come from your bills of materials that your engineers produce. And then you're going to look at your estimated cost change. In this case, I said, well, let's just assume that there's no cost change. And let me just stop for a moment and talk about for a second the situation we're currently in. If I were trying to put together a budget in this particular time frame, it would be nothing short of a disaster. There'd be no way to really put it together in any kind of a meaningful way because there's so much uncertainty as to when we're going to be able to restart the economy, what the economy is going to do. I mean, you've got economists talking about an L-shaped recovery, which is basically flat recovery over many, many months or even years. You've got some talking about a U-shaped recovery where you have some trough that you spend some time in before the recovery, and then the recovery goes basically up, just like a U. And then you have some saying that, well, it's more going to be more like a V where it went down precipitously and it's going to go up in the same way. And it looks more like a V recovery. I think that you could put together some scenarios for all three of those kind of situations, but I really don't think that it's a process that would be easy or even accurate at this point. For instance, the price of oil this morning was $20 a barrel, and so that's a precipitous decline over what it used to be, and that's what these products are made from. Okay, and so you wouldn't really be able to kind of estimate that that was going to happen in your budget. So think about everybody's budget that existed prior to the pandemic. Your budget would be completely out the window for the vast majority of industries. Anyway, so we would probably have a best case scenario, an expected scenario budget, and a worst case scenario budget. And even then, I think it'd be hard for most people to get their hands around some sort of a worst case scenario budget like this one. Anyway, like this pandemic would have created for us. So anyway, you're going to get these numbers from your engineering staff, from your bills of material. And if you have a very sophisticated system, you might be able to run these directly from there And you would probably want to try to do that to the best you can because remember you're going to have multiple products. You might have 50 or 60 products. So this can become very complex very quickly. Um, but in this case, we'll just make the assumption that we just have a few products. And so what I would do is I would pull from the bills of material what these usages are. And let's say that this one's zero point 0.7 and again, we'll just stay with the same numbers, 0.675, and we'll get a number in between here, call it 0.685, and then zero point 0.7 for the last one. And, we'll just say that the same thing is true over here. So I'm just going to Control C and move it over here and Control V it using the same numbers again so that I don't have to redo those. And I'm going to not assume any estimated cost change just to make this thing kind of easier to see right now. But of course, you'd look to see whether or not you were going to have a change in cost. If you thought it was going to go down, you'd apply those and as negative numbers in terms of percentages, maybe -5%, and then work through the math. And the same thing is true over here. In this case, I just said, well, let's just for this point in time, let's just skip it. And so all I did was take this number times this number to get to this number. And so having done that, I can just, oops, having done that, I can just drag these down and then come over here. And the reason I couldn't just double click that is because I didn't have anything here. But and then drag this one down because I did the same thing here, which is simply this number times this number and drag it on down. And this number is just simply a reflection of this number plus this number. And of course, there are some decimals. If I were to look at this on out, you can see that it actually is a different number. But even if you're looking at it like I was looking at it before, like this one, in terms of Excel, it assumes these decimals. Okay, so when it makes the multiplication, if you were to say, well, 1 times 20 is 20, well, if you look down here, when we get to this point, you're going to see that that number would not be 1 times whatever your unit sales are because it's gonna go to those decimals that you have underlying. All right, so we'll just drag all those down. So we have some fairly easy to work with costs over here. And now the next thing you would do is you would have an estimated beginning. What do you want to start the year with in terms of all of your products? And then over here, desired ending inventory. And I'm just going to skip that for now and just look at what we're actually going to produce this year. Let's assume for a second that we have the same requirement in beginning and ending inventory, so we wouldn't have to work with that necessarily. And now the next thing is, of course, we're going to take the unit sales that we computed over here in the sales budget times our cost over here for materials. So it's just simply going to be equal to this number here times, and then you're going to go over and pick up from your sales budget your unit sales for that product for January. And then just drag it on down. And the same thing would be true then for each of these. So if I look at February, then it's going to be equal to this number here times, and go back over to your sales budget, pick up the February unit sales, and so forth. Okay. And the numbers are getting so large now that we're having to expand the cell size. And that's all I did here. I went to point to the intersection of G and H, those columns, and just double clicked to get there. And then I would do that for every one of these. Okay. And that would then give me my total cost for materials. Then over on direct labor, I do the exact same thing. And I'm going to assume that there's no change here. And so I'm just going to say that one is equal to the other and drag it down. And this is going to give me my labor cost. Same thing there. I'm going to go equal this number, go back over to my sales budget, multiply it. Whoops, let me go back over here. Got to give it a function. Doesn't like it without a function. Times over here on the sales budget for January units. And I did something wrong here. Here, let me escape from that one. Let me start over. Equal to this number here, and this would be the cost per unit, times, and then go over to the sales budget and find the first unit in January and do the same thing for each of those. And you would proceed in exactly the same way that you did for your materials budget. And so it would give you your sales, your labor cost for each one of these guys per. Okay. And this particular product, if you can imagine it, it's a machine molded product. So there might be one individual running 10 machines and then basically not doing anything other than watch them come off. And there may not be even a person standing there. So your labor cost, relatively speaking, is going to be very small. In this case, you're probably working with machine hours instead of direct labor hours to begin with as an activity base. Okay, and then popping over to your factory overhead budget. In this case, I think I've already penciled in some, and you would do exactly the same thing. These, in this case, what I'm looking at is the overhead cost per machine hour. And over here, we have the machine hours. So if you had an estimated change in those costs, you would pencil those in. Otherwise, you would come over here and multiply this times this to get to your new cost per machine hour. And then you would do it the same way that you did your materials budget. So it would just be constantly building up the costs. And of course, over here, you have to understand that you've got both of these products, okay? So in order to get to your total overhead, you're going to do the same thing. And over here from the direct labor budget, I've said that product A is just a single cost because there wouldn't be very much labor involved. Over here, it's more complicated because you have different machines running these different products. So, and how did you get to this overhead cost per machine hour? Well, that's a very complicated process that you'd have to go through. But the overhead cost per machine hour would be you'd take all your machine hours and you would look at all of the overhead that you could associate with those. You would have to do some allocations of overhead that would be kind of generalized overhead. So, for example, floor space. If I've got a machine sitting in a certain area in the floor, how would I allocate the amount of depreciation um, to that machine? Well, it'd probably be on some sort of basis of floor space, but it isn't quite that simple because what about all those empty spaces? You have to actually take a step back and try to think through how you would actually build up the costs that will go into these overhead costs per machine hours. But once you have them, then you just multiply this one times this one and get it, and then multiply this one times this one and get it, and you add the two together just the same way you did material and come over here and come up with your January and numbers. Okay. And and I should have said this is where your cost per unit is going to come to in each one of these after you've done, if there are going to be changes in your overhead, which there probably would be, you multiply this number times whatever you arrived at over here. And so this is your new cost times, and then you would add that you'd have another column over here for your total, just like you did for materials. And it would come down to your January when you multiply this one times your unit sales, just like you did for materials. And then the cost of sales budget is simply an accumulation of this, and this as you calculated those. And so it's just kind of a summary of that. And then let's take a look quickly at the selling expense budget. And I don't have anything penciled in here, but what would be in here? Well, you would have commissions, sales commissions if you had them. you'd have advertising, you'd have promotion. And again, you would want to separate these in terms of variable and fixed costs. And the reason that you're doing that is why? Well, because remember that we have to calculate what our enterprise wide break even point is. And this is the way you go about doing it. You have to have your variable costs and your fixed costs. When we looked over here at these the factory overhead budget, um, in this particular case, when we would have some mix in here that we would have to separate out. Okay. So I didn't do that on this particular budget, but if you were doing it in real life, you have to figure out how much of this is fixed and how much of it's variable. In terms of the direct labor, this is all variable. In terms of the material, it's all variable, meaning that for every product that you produce, if your cost over here is 27 cents, then every time you produce one, it's 27 cents. But if you think about depreciation is $100,000 built into your factory overhead. It doesn't change from 100,000. Okay, but there are portions of this overhead cost that will be variable. So you'll have to break out which portion of this machine hour is variable. And for our purposes here, I just assumed that it all was. Okay. Now that wouldn't be the case. You would have some fixed overhead down here that you would have to look at. But it would be that if you were to schedule it out, it might be something. It might look like 100,000, 100,000, and 100. I mean, going across, it would be the same number all the way across. So once you had one, you can just simply drag it all the way across because it's going to be the same number. Okay, because your fixed overhead's not going to change. Again, within some relevant range. I'm not going to get into relevant range at this point, but anyway, within that relevant range. But these other costs, and you would have to work through them. What are they? Well, again, you would have advertising, promotions, sales salaries, the maybe insurance that goes along with the the uh, the sales salary itself, the cost of health insurance and those sorts of things. And down here, on the other hand, you would have the depreciation on the building. You would have supervisor salaries that are fixed that don't change over time. And whatever those costs were, you would schedule those out. And again, if you were to look at them, they would be the same for every month. And of course, you'd have January, February, March, April, May, all the way across the top, just like you did before. Um, and I don't know whether I've shown you this or not. I probably did, but you'd simply drag that out. It automatically assumes that the next one is going to be popped up as whatever it should be, right? So April follows March and so forth. Anyway, the administrative expense budget, same thing. You'd separate it between variable costs and fixed costs. Fixed costs would be things like the accountant's salary, the purchasing person's salary, the president's salary, any kind of management fees that you might have from your corporate headquarters. Those would all wind up in the fixed section down here. In the variable section, well, you've got clerical workers, you've got office supplies, all of those things that change over time, depending upon what your. Hopefully, they run in conjunction with your sales, or you would at least budget them that way, even if they don't necessarily run exactly that way. And these things are, this is an age of advanced mathematics, an age of artificial intelligence, and of course, you would be able to employ some of those things to get you a better handle on if I have sales of $20,000, what's my office supplies. I mean, if it was worth it to you to do that, then depending on the size of your business, you might do it. I know that I've in some situations I've seen rewards being given to those people who come closest to their budget and their actual comes closest to their budget. So if you're a controller and you were working in that environment, you would take extra care to make sure that your budget was as close as possible, and you might look at some advanced techniques to come up with what your office supply cost is when you have $20,000 worth of sales. Okay, um, so that's your administrative expense budget. You'd have another income and expense budget. It's a fairly small one, hopefully. Other income and expense could be things like currency translations, things like that. This gets into the more sophisticated side. For the most part, it can be interest expense, of course, interest income and expense, and those may be fairly significant things. Um, and then when you get into more comprehensive income, then you're talking about something that probably, if you're like let's just say that you're a division, you're probably not going to worry about those kind of things. Those things will all be determined at the corporate level. Cash budget. Now, cash budgets, this is just in terms of how much cash I'm going to need and how much cash I'm going to raise. And in the real world, when you're actually looking at a cash budget, it's probably done on a 13-week basis. Why 13? Well, there are 52 weeks in a year and 13 weeks in a quarter. Okay, so you're doing a budget every quarter, and it's a rolling budget that you look at, so that in week two, week one falls off, and you pick up what would be week 14, okay, if you were looking at the first 13 weeks of the year. But that would be the way you would do it each week. The week first in that sequence would fall off, and then the last week or the next week that you're going to work with would pick up. So you're constantly doing a cash budget. Capital budgets, again, this would be something that you would send out. Um, Let me pause this for a minute. 1 second.